Having seen the rise of industrialization and capitalism and the competition for colonies and militarism and nationalism that arose as an effect of those big changes, we're going to start looking at the way they came home to Europe in the age of total war, the age of extremes from 1914 to 1945. Although both of these wars took place largely in Europe, they were world wars, largely because of the age of imperialism that we just studied. And so today we're going to introduce this unit that goes from World War I, the world's first total war, to its effects, including the rise of politically extreme ideologies in a number of states like fascism, Nazism, and Soviet-style communism, to the road to the next World War, World War II. The First World War set in motion the major events that shaped 20th century history, including the rise of Soviet Russia, the world's first communist state, the Great Depression, which gripped the world, not just the United States, World War II, and the Cold War that followed it. And so in this unit, we're going to kind of trace those causes and effects and really look at all of these concepts to get a good understanding of what they mean. Here's a brief summary. In the aftermath of World War I, Europe was transformed and disillusioned. The communist revolution in Russia resulted in the creation of the world's first communist state, and the world reacted against that. Competing ideologies, nationalist ideologies, emerged in Italy and Germany as fascist totalitarian states transformed themselves to deal with the challenges of a Great Depression and a post-war world. All of this led to a new world war, World War II, which saw an even greater mobilization of the state's resources, including people, in both the home countries and the colonies for the purposes of waging war. Governments also used propaganda to mobilize these populations. This conflict caused death on an unprecedented scale, leading to the detonation of the world's first nuclear device on a civilian target by the United States. The war ends with a dramatically new conflict. A chastised Europe lays in ruins after the war, while the United States and the Soviet Union are ready to emerge as the new superpowers in a new global landscape, one marred by the amazing power of the atom bomb, leaving only devastation in its wake. In our next unit, we'll be looking at the Cold War, which created 50 years of hostility dividing the world between capitalist and communist camps, creating a paradox of security. Threats to global and national security evolved from traditional declared wars among nations, like World War II, to limited proxy wars, like the Vietnam War and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the threat of nuclear war to civil wars. Themes from previous units that you'll see pop up here include industrialization, imperialism, nationalism, and competing mutually exclusive economic ideologies like capitalism and communism. And on this slide you have, as a timeline or as a concept map, an overview of the unit. And if that kind of thing is going to help you think through the unit that comes, it's not the worst idea in the world to pause the slide here and copy one of those down. Big questions we get to ask in this unit include, do states have moral obligations beyond pursuing the best interests of their people? Regarding the theme of civilization that we've been poking through throughout our study of world history, the First World War, as a total war requiring support from the masses, was maybe the first war in which the battle was discussed as one of good versus evil, rather than a battle to achieve strategic objectives. This twist on civilization versus barbarism, in turn, fed into state ideologies and fed into the violence. The Second World War amplified and was the tragic consequence of these dynamics. While the good guys and the bad guys in this context might seem obvious, we want students to explore the moral ambiguities inherent to modern warfare. Good and evil aren't so clear-cut as they seem if you really dig into the details. Does the good side only do good things? Going deeper, if one person kills another, does it matter how or under what circumstances it happens? Bombing versus shooting, chemical warfare versus gunfire, and how do you draw those lines? In terms of our empire and imperialism theme, we can look at World War II in that context. Were Germany and Japan merely following a pattern set by the Allied powers in both world wars? Expansion and imperialism for resources, paying little heed to the welfare of those in the land they wanted. In other words, World War II usually looms pretty big in the popular imagination, and for good reason. The Holocaust was horrific. The question here is, how different is that from what colonizers and empire builders had been doing to the conquered throughout world history? So how did we get here? The industrial age and its global effects lead pretty steadily to World War I. We've seen how Western nations seeking raw materials to fuel industrial production launched a wave of imperial conquests, kind of splitting up the globe amongst themselves, and how the system of competition for imperial power between the great powers of Europe and the industrial capacity to mass produce weapons of increasing lethality like the machine gun eventually not just led to the European domination of the globe, but those chickens come home to roost in one of the most devastating wars in history, the First World War, which takes place on European soil. In terms of how imperialism and World War I connect, we can see how the steam engine and the Maxim machine gun helped spread the tidal wave of European imperialism that swept across Africa and the world in the later parts of the 19th century. The technologies of the Industrial Revolution opened up new horizons of conquest and led to the European competition for dominance, which is often seen as one of the main causes for the outbreak of World War I. Another one, though, it's a little subtle, but because Europeans had all of this advanced technology and they kept using them against opponents who didn't, they came to believe that winning wars was a lot easier than it actually would be if they faced off against another army that was likewise armed with industrially produced weapons. And that's exactly what's going to happen in World War I. By the early 1900s, so just before World War I, we've seen how Germany, the nation, united and formed a state, a new state, that changed the balance of power in Europe. And Italy did the same. Russia, off to the east, was still basically a medieval state with a feudal system, an aristocracy, and an emperor called a czar. And it had not industrialized, but it was huge. There was a ton of land, and it had a giant army. Britain was strong through her empire and through her navy, although she was like a little tiny island if you just look at the map. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic land empire held together by a shaky emperor, was weakening and insecure about it, but friends with Germany, even though it lost some land to Prussia. France was very bitter and very anxious about losing land to the newly formed Germany, which had a huge army and was right next door and therefore constituted a threat. All of these states were competing for colonies, all of these states were competing to have the strongest military, and all of these states were increasingly very nationalist, and that's going to cause some problems. And this lesson, we're going to pause to take notes in several different parts. So be ready for that. The reason for that is that the vocabulary we talk about here is going to really structure your understanding of the whole unit. So the better you understand it now, the better you'll get the unit generally. And our first big concept is total war. The first half of the 20th century was dominated by two total wars among the great powers of Europe, Asia, and the United States. These wars were caused in part by massive military production made possible by the Industrial Revolution and by a global competition for territories during the age of imperialism. And these two total wars were the First and Second World Wars, also called World War I and World War II. Total war is a big unit concept, so you need to really understand what it means and what it implies and how it's different from the kind of warfare that existed before. Total war is a war that requires each country involved to mobilize its entire population and resources to sustain the war effort. In other words, it's not just the soldiers going out to a battlefield, it's everybody in a state and the state's entire economy that needs to kick into gear in order to win a war. In these kinds of wars, civilians, by which is meant people who aren't in the military, regular people, play an active role by producing supplies, weapons, rationing food, that sort of thing for the troops. And their lives are significantly affected by the fact that their state is at war, even if the battles occur far away. This also means that, tragically, civilian targets also become more common in this type of warfare. In other words, taking out civilians if they're the enemy comes to seem legitimate and valid as a strategy in total war. So, total war doesn't just involve soldiers fighting soldiers. It requires the civilian population to contribute and actively support the war effort in their activities and in their opinions. And it requires the whole economy to shift gears to emphasize weapons production, and often involves more civilian casualties than traditional warfare. Added to the mix is the fact that new weapons, like the airplane that can drop bombs on cities, increase the reach of the battlefield further than ever and increase the effects on civilians. If you can take out an entire city, you might get a strategic advantage, but you've also killed a lot of people that didn't sign up for war. So this becomes the dilemma in the age of total war. So pause here, get a definition for total war, a good one, in your notes, and then press play again. The next part of the story is in terms of how government changed because of this kind of warfare. Total war requires mass mobilization, not just huge armies, but a population that supports these kinds of wars, because this is also the age of increasing democracy, so government power increasingly depends on the people's support. So for a government to wage war successfully, the people have to support it in their opinions. And the entire economy has to make sure that the army gets what it needs, because wars are expensive. So all of this, the mass mobilization and the need for industrially supplied armies, mean that the role of government expanded a lot during this time period. And that can mean in terms of just its role in the economy, because it has to direct the war economy, which you can see in the graph on the right. It can also mean in terms of shaping people's opinions through propaganda or more. A big part of this story has to do with the concept of ideology, or the isms: socialism, capitalism, liberalism, communism, conservatism, fascism, the isms. So we've seen this word before. We're going to go over it again. An ideology is a set of beliefs or values that affects our outlook of the world, our most closely held set of values and feelings. And it acts as kind of a filter through which people see everything and everybody, through which people experience the world. These beliefs are often so close to us that we don't realize they're there. We just simply think that our beliefs are natural and obvious and true. We've seen in our study of history so far economic ideologies, for example, that provides the goal for different economic systems, like capitalism, with the goal of making the most profits for business owners, or socialism, which has the goal of reducing inequality. Ideologies aren't always bad, but they can sometimes lead people, without even them noticing, to use them in place of thinking, and that's where they get dangerous. If people subscribe to an ideology, they can start to apply just broad principles that match that ideology instead of thinking for themselves. And then it makes it very easy for leaders to exploit this when masses follow ideological positions blindly. And we'll see this tragically in this unit. Over the millennia, political philosophers have created a variety of political ideologies, which describe ways governments and societies can be organized and why, like for what goal. Some of them are totally benign, some of them we live with every day, and some of them are incredibly extreme and involve like massive human costs. And in this unit, we're going to be looking at a lot of these extreme ideologies. And here's kind of your warning and my plea for the unit. A lot of the vocabulary we're about to talk about today and in the unit is complicated because they describe concepts that require a certain amount of thinking before they click, because they're not clear-cut, like fascism and totalitarianism, for example. But this complex vocabulary is incredibly important because these concepts describe things that are horrible and need to never happen again. And being able to name them makes it easier to know them when you see them, which is a big part of keeping the worst parts of our history from repeating. And tragically, these things are not done with us. Concepts like fascism and totalitarianism are clearly coming back in some parts of the world. I'm recording this in 2021. The last 4 years have made that absolutely clear to me. And in other parts of the world, they never went away after this part of history. Fascism, for example, is a horrible ideology that involves toxic, aggressive nationalism that identifies enemies of the people falsely, blames them for social problems, and encourages followers to stamp them out. It's dehumanizing, it causes massive death, and it is back. Totalitarianism, likewise, is a form of rule. It's a way that governments use their power that involves taking full power over people's private lives and thoughts to make sure that they're following the state ideology. It is antithetical to human rights. And even before modern surveillance technology, the human cost was beyond imagination, like secret police hauling people off because they may have said something that a neighbor reported. Imagine how much worse this could be in the age of the internet and Alexa, and literally everything we do potentially could be recorded. These ideas we need to guard against actively, more actively than we have probably. And so it's like one of the most important parts of what I can teach you. And so like I'm begging you, even though it's hard to understand these concepts at first, try, pay attention, be patient with yourself, because eventually after a little bit of seeing how they work, it will click. For these early lessons, I suggest you write down keywords for each concept and maybe even try to draw them. That tends to work pretty well, leaving yourself space to come back and add detail in your notes. In terms of recommended reading, I'll just get that out of the way here because people ask me every year. A number of books are wonderful on these topics. This is not a full list, but the books that are on the screen right now, I highly recommend if you want to understand fascism and how that works. Totalitarianism, that is a difficult book to get through. So like once you're in college, I highly recommend you try reading it. For the rise of Nazi Germany, the classic remains The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Very readable. It was written by an American journalist who was living in Germany in the 1930s. And in terms of how the Holocaust worked and how it was experienced by a person who was sent to a death camp, Survival in Auschwitz remains the most stunning book of that whole genre, in my opinion, written by Primo Levi, who was in Auschwitz and managed to survive. In terms of the big personalities of the century, Stephen Kotkin's biography of Stalin is fantastic. And Ian Kershaw's work on Hitler, if you want to understand like incredible detail about his life, remains the classic. For primary sources, after World War II, there were war crime trials called, one of the most famous was the Nuremberg trials, but there were several. And you can actually find the trial transcripts and all of the evidence presented, which covers basically all of this history in a really unique and interesting way. For documentaries, Peter Jackson's They Shall Not Grow Old took footage from World War I and colorized it, which really humanizes people a lot. It's stunning. I recommend it highly if you want to like actually watch this history play out. For the Holocaust, the BBC produced a series of like 4 or 5 episodes, maybe 6, called Auschwitz, the Nazis, and the Final Solution. It is fantastic. It's the best I've seen. And last I checked, it was on Netflix. And for one of the more interesting moments in history that people tend to skip, the hinge moments, like what happened immediately after World War II. How did society recover from that kind of trauma? There's another fantastic series called After Hitler. I believe National Geographic produced it, and you can find it on the internet. So, like I said, vocabulary in this lesson is going to be complicated, but super important. And we're taking notes in several parts. And the best way to go about doing this is to listen first, then pause the slide and get down keywords. The main thing we're trying to trace here, the cause and effect, is getting from total war, where a state's entire resources and population have to be mobilized in order to have a hope of winning, to governments taking on a larger role in society and the growth of extreme political ideologies. First, let's look at how total war and ideology led to the government to have an expanded role. And here I've done a couple of things because details are helpful for some people and confusing for others. So in the blue box in the middle of the slide, I summarized the main point of the information on this slide. If you need a big overarching summary, look there for notes first. If you need details, look at the outline. I'll go over it with you though. All right, so because total war required a full participation from the full population, governments had to get more involved and more creative about generating that kind of support. One of the ways they did that is they used ideologies like nationalism, some of which already existed. And then later, when we get to World War II, we'll see how fascism and communism and Nazism come into play here to mobilize their people to support the state in war efforts, both at home and also in the colonies. And remember, an ideology is a coherent set of values and ideas about how society should be organized. It works towards an ideal goal that shapes how people see the world. Sometimes ideologies can be really useful shorthand. Like if somebody tells you that they're liberal, you don't need to have a whole conversation before figuring out several things that they stand for. Generally, they're fine with diversity, they're fine with extending rights to more people, that sort of thing. On the other hand, remember too that ideologies can also be kind of dangerous when people start to use them instead of thinking. So instead of saying like, I'm liberal, therefore I support more rights for more people, people start saying I'm liberal, the liberal position on this issue is X, therefore X is good and I don't have to think about it. So when people start applying these broad ideological principles instead of thinking for themselves, it becomes very easy for leaders to exploit this and use that like blind following of ideology to their benefit. And we'll see how this works when we get to the more dangerous ideologies like fascism and Nazism. In addition to ideology, governments also used a mix of strategies to mobilize these populations, including political speeches, art, increasingly media, and also intensified forms of nationalism to get support for total war and to spread the dominant ideology of the state where that applies. The First World War, as a total war requiring support from the masses, was maybe the first war in which the battle was discussed as one of good versus evil, instead of like a fight to get strategic objectives like land. This is a twist on civilization versus barbarism, a theme that we've been tracing throughout all of world history. And it in turn fed into state ideologies that fed off violence. For example, if you think that you're at war with somebody because you want something they have, that's one thing. But if you think that you're at war with another group of people because they're morally flawed and evil human beings, that changes things. That changes your outlook of the purpose of war, and that changes slowly but surely the level of acceptance the public has for violence against different groups of people. And that can be very, very dangerous, as we'll see, to tragic results when we get to the Holocaust. The Second World War clearly amplified this dynamic, but it was already in the works during World War I, and it's an effect of total war because it's really hard to generate really strong support and sacrifice from an entire population unless you can tell them that they're fighting like a morally good battle. Mobilizing the society for total war necessarily demanded deeper involvement by the state into all aspects of life then, and states used propaganda to generate support for the war. In other words, states became more and more involved in shaping civilian opinions and becoming involved in their daily lives to a greater extent than ever before. And propaganda is an interesting thing because it can be used for both extremist politics, almost as a brainwashing kind of tactic, but it's also pretty common in more traditional democratic societies too. And it is a key vessel for spreading ideology. So the main idea here is that total war leads to the government taking on a much more active role in society and in people's daily lives to mobilize civilians and soldiers for the war effort, using propaganda, ideology, defining an enemy as evil, and the war effort as a moral good. So pause this slide here, get some of these key ideas in your notes, and then press play again. These dynamics led to some pretty horrific violence in the 20th century. Once you get to people thinking on ideological terms and defining different groups of people as evil, you get the makings for more and more acceptance of more and more horrific violence against others. And we'll see this in the spiking number of genocides throughout the 20th century, not just the Holocaust, but also the Armenian genocide, what happened when Soviet communism collectivized the farms and the Great Terror, in China, in Pakistan, the Cambodian genocide, Rwanda. All of these trends are effects of this idea of thinking of your group as good and the other group as evil. And this all really started with World War I, which is a fascinating war to study because of all of the twists and turns in the storyline. So this is what we're going to study next. I'll give you a brief overview here. World War I occurred between 1914 and 1918, mostly in Europe, though with soldiers from all over the world because European states owned colonies. So it was between the great powers of Europe and their colonies, and eventually 3 years in, the United States. The thing about this war is it was about industrial armies with mass-produced weapons against other industrial armies with mass-produced weapons. So it was unprecedented, and the carnage was horrific. All of these states had gotten very used to using their weapons of war against populations that didn't have any. So they thought war would be quick and easy. They thought wars were easy to win, and they were all very wrong when it turns out that, like, if you shoot machine guns against machine guns, nobody wins. It was the first total war because you need to continue supplying increasingly large armies with industrially produced weapons in order to win. It was unimaginably destructive, in a way that caught people at the time completely by surprise. And so it was really traumatic as well for an entire generation of people. And this becomes really interesting to trace because the generation that fought in World War I was the generation making decisions during World War II. At the end of the day, after the war, you ended up with millions dead, the collapse of some empires, the European land-based empires, a successful communist revolution in Russia, which became known as the Soviet Union, unsuccessful revolutions elsewhere that inspired fascist movements in reaction, the rise of Nazism, the origins of World War II, and nothing whatsoever gained for the winners. Nothing. If we look at a map too, you can kind of see the sea change that occurred in Europe during this time. World War I was Germany and Austria-Hungary primarily, although they're allies as well, against France, Russia, and Great Britain primarily, and their allies. Notice how Germany and Austria-Hungary are kind of in the middle, surrounded by states that they had to fight. That's going to be an important part of the story going forward. World War I reshaped the map of Europe and their colonies. So have a look at what Europe looked like after, keeping an eye on Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Russia. This is after. You have a number of new states in Eastern Europe. This before, this after. Crumbling empires, a radically different world. This radically different world after World War I led pretty directly to the rise of politically extreme ideologies and politics. So here again, I'm going to go through what might be kind of complicated information. I want you guys to listen first and then pause and take notes at the end. Right. World War I was really the cause of a number of effects that we're going to trace throughout the unit in the 20th century, including the Russian Revolution, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism and Nazism, World War II, etc. So here's how that worked. World War I caused massive destruction and gigantic changes that society in Europe was not prepared to process. And this led to the rise of political extremism that would have incredibly harmful effects on people throughout the 20th century. Here's how that worked. World War I was brutal and devastating for all participants except for the United States. And I say except for the United States because the United States participated, but it was located very far away, completely safe. The damage occurred primarily in Europe. Because of this devastation, and because of having been led into a war by politicians who, promised that it was a good, right war, and then at the end nothing was gained, people started to think that society needed radical changes to address the problems raised by World War I. When people start looking for radical quick fixes to really big, complicated problems, you have the makings for the rise of political extremism. World War I was the first major war fought in Europe in a century, and it was the first war with all parties using industrially produced weapons like the machine gun, so the destruction was massive and shocking. And that meant that old certainties about governing structures that got people into the war to begin with were called into question. In other words, if the governments that we have could get us into this mess, maybe they're not the right governments for us. In response to war-provoked economic crisis, for example, for an early example, in 1917, the Russian Revolution kicked out the Tsar and then killed him, and then created the first communist state, the Soviet Union. This in itself was a sign of political extremism. Like, the problem was devastation from the war, and the solution was rapid transition to a communist economy to, in theory, get rid of private property and do it all within the span of a few years. That's extreme. But that also led to the rise of reactionary extremism too. Fear of communism spreading led other states to move to the right, to a more nationalist, aggressive, anti-communist solution. Similarly, after the war, many of the old empires in Europe were broken up and replaced with new states that were new democracies without any experience in self-government. And it turns out that democracy, you have to kind of learn how it works. If you look on the map, circled in blue, you'll see like a bunch of, it's not a perfect circle, but you know, that's the general zone, a bunch of new states that suddenly were experiencing self-government. In these states, voters didn't always have an easy time judging new politicians, which meant that some of them were likely to be swayed by extremist politics. And then finally, you had the Great Depression 10 years after World War I, which caused huge social, economic, and political problems worldwide that were drastic enough that people were ready to follow any leader that promised to make things better, which led to political instability and the rise of extremist politics. So go ahead and pause the slide here and get in your notes the cause and effect between World War I and political instability. Here's another map of those new states and the world's first communist state. All right, we're almost done. We have 2 more slides of notes. I told you it would be complicated, but like I said, the vocabulary is really, really important, and we're going to be coming back to it in pretty much every lesson. All right, so I keep talking about political extremism. Here's what it was. Political extremism describes extreme ideologies that seek rapid, radical changes in all aspects of society and politics to achieve a specific goal that's often related to an overly simplistic view of how to improve society, often paired with authoritarian governments to accomplish that goal. So that's a lot. Here's what it means. It means that extremist politics usually rely on a leader with a ton of power who promises to make things better by identifying the source of really complicated society's problems in a super overly simplistic way. The nature of these changes, like the things that are going to radically change, how they're put into place, and especially the ultimate goal, the prescription for society, are what distinguish the various types of extremist views. And they're dangerous because the goal becomes so important that often it takes primacy over people's lives. And people tend to come to think that sacrificing a few lives isn't such a big price to pay if we can achieve this fantastic utopian goal. So we've looked at, if you look at the little spectrum on the bottom, it might help. We've looked at communism already as an idea in this class, which is an extreme version of socialism, because socialism says, let's make inequality less bad, and communism says, let's eliminate it altogether and abolish private property. And that's the goal, and that will fix society. Communism rises in the Soviet Union, and we're going to be tracing that story in the unit. 2 new concepts that arise out of World War I that were horrifically damaging and tragically are not dead yet are fascism and Nazism. Those are right-wing, extreme nationalist ideologies. Remember, nationalism and communism are kind of opposites. Nationalism says you should identify with the national group or the state first. Communism says you should identify with your class, social class. These are kind of complex ideologies, so I'm going to give you the long definition and then like a shorter way to remember what they are and how they're different from one another. Fascism is a political ideology rooted in extreme aggressive nationalism that glorifies action, violence, discipline, and above all, blind loyalty to the state. The strength of the state under fascist politics is held to be more important than any individual or their rights. And anyone, any individual or any group who's seen as threatening to the strength of the state tends to be targeted as enemies of the people, which is really scary. Fascism also kind of implies that, like, because your nation and the state are the most important thing and their strength is important, they feel that they're entitled to take things from other states, to be aggressive and expanding, to look after the interests of their own national group as aggressively as they need to, at the expense of others. Nazism is a variety of fascism. So it's everything that fascism is, plus the added detail that it emphasizes racial purity and combines elements of anti-communism, racism, and anti-Semitism. It shares a lot of traits with fascism, including the strong nationalist idea and a focus on the national state community, and the value it places on action, militarism, violence, and authoritarian government. So in terms of like this idea that we can think of politically extreme ideologies as ideas that have a goal for society that they think will magically fix all of the problems that they want to implement really fast. We can see communism's goal as abolishing private property. That's how you fix everything. For fascism, it's extremely aggressive nationalism that believes that taking stuff from inferior people is fine. It's like nationalism on steroids, or survival of the fittest on steroids. Nazism agrees, adding that racial purity would also solve problems. So, again, that's a lot. Get some preliminary notes from these ideas, definitely what political extremism is, and see if you can articulate fascism and Nazism. Drawing pictures for these things is one of the best ways to go. Then press play again for one last piece of the puzzle. Here's the last piece of the puzzle, and it's the form of government that develops as a result of all of these problems and all of these politically extreme ideologies, and that is totalitarianism. The brutality of World War I, combined with propaganda, and governments being more intensely involved in the lives of ordinary citizens than ever before, and these extreme ideologies like Soviet-style communism on the left, and then fascism and Nazism on the right, helped form the world's first totalitarian states. Totalitarianism is another one of those terrifying concepts that needs to never come back again, and knowing what it is and how it works is a key piece of that puzzle. Totalitarianism describes a government that takes total, full, centralized state control over every aspect of public and private life, and involves mobilizing all state resources to pursue an ideological goal that, if achieved, they believe would create a utopian or perfect state. So totalitarianism involves a government that makes it its business not only to direct the economy and laws, but also like to monitor people's private thoughts and communications and the way they think about the state and make sure that they're following a state ideology. It's scary. And it's the form of government that paired with extremist ideologies in this time period, like Soviet-style communism, fascism, and Nazism. All of them had totalitarian governments. Nowadays, you can probably find it in North Korea. At the time, people tended to support totalitarian leaders because they appeared to provide a sense of security and gave people a direction for the future. However, totalitarian rule also relies on things like secret police to crush opposition and create a sense of fear among the people. In other words, they rule through both control and persuasion. People, to different degrees, agree with totalitarian leaders, and then they also make it their business to scare the hell out of anybody who doesn't. So these include the use of terror, indoctrination, like brainwashy propaganda, censorship, persecution, prison camps, gulags, etc. Totalitarianism, just to clarify, it's not an ideology, it's a style of rule. It describes how a government uses power, usually for an ideological end. So pause here, get some notes on totalitarianism, and then press play again so that I can maybe clarify some of these ideas. All right, first, the difference between moderate and extreme political ideologies. Moderate political ideologies are like regular, everyday, have been around for a while, do not cause massive death kinds of political ideologies, like liberalism and conservatism. They tend to support the existing social organization or the state. They don't require a revolution, and they seek gradual reform to meet their goals. They work in democracies, so like people usually have some sort of a say in these kinds of governments, and they tend to preserve individual rights, thus limiting the power of government. Nowadays, you can see them in liberalism, or the ideology that Democrats in the United States tend to follow, which we call the political left, or conservatism, which is the ideology that traditional Republicans tend to follow, which we call the political right. Extreme ideologies are very different. They seek radical revolutionary change to replace the existing social order or the state altogether. And this change they want is sudden and drastic. So not like voting to expand rights, but completely overthrowing the state and imposing a different way of doing things by force. With these extreme ideologies, when they come into play, usually the state takes full power to quickly enact the radical change the ideology wants, which requires a complete change in how things are done normally. So radical political ideologies tend to have totalitarian states in 20th century history. And rather than preserving individual rights, they tend to threaten or eliminate individual rights altogether in order to further the goal, whatever the ideology says is the goal. And we're going to study in this unit Soviet communism on the left and fascism and Nazism on the right. In terms of totalitarianism, this describes a form of government, so like how power is structured. You can contrast it to democracy, which is moderate, it's a normal form of government for us, and totalitarianism is the more extreme form of government. So for example, in democracies, people have rights that limit the power of government. This is not true for totalitarian rule. In democracies, people can think whatever they want. Totalitarian rule does not permit this. They have secret police and consequences for showing evidence of going against state ideology. And in democracies, there's a difference between public life and politics versus private life, or what happens in the home. We have like an expectation of privacy, to use the words of the Constitution. Totalitarian governments do not recognize this distinction. So, sometimes when we look at really complicated new concepts, it's hard to understand them without a contrast. And if that's the case, think of totalitarianism in contrast to democracy, and you should be able to understand it a little bit better. Another way we can look at this is on a spectrum. So this might actually be a wonderful thing to have in your notes. And this is the last slide, I promise. We can think of ideologies on a spectrum of left to right. On the far left, we have Soviet communism, which aims for full equality with no individual rights, based on the ideas of Marx, but combined with a totalitarian government, which makes things really, really scary. All the way on the far right, we have fascism and Nazism, which have the goal of having a strong, aggressive state with a pure, like racially pure community, and they respect no individual rights. The ideas that kind of fuel fascism, Nazism are social Darwinism, survival of the fittest as applied to societies, that fake science. Those are both extreme, and they're both ruled by totalitarian governments, and they both hate each other, which is going to become really important because when communism gets strong, you'll see fascism and Nazism rise as a reaction. In the middle, we have political ideologies that work in democracies that can coexist. You can have liberals and conservatives in the same state with no problem. And they're still around today. So on the number 2 spot towards the left, we have liberalism, socialism, social democrats, ideologies that promote more equality, more human rights, and respect for individual rights. And they're for gradual change to these goals. In the number 3 spot, on the right side, you have conservatism, where the modern American Republican Party traditionally stood. I say traditionally because it's been moving farther right in the last 4 years, and again, I'm recording in 2021. So before 2016, at least, you could say Republicans would have been in the number 3 spot, valuing tradition as a guide to action, valuing individual rights, but more capitalistic, more against change, and more on the side of like keeping things the way they have been is good. So for the last time, please pause the slide here, get this in your notes, maybe using a different color for the extremist ideologies, and that's it for the day.